So The Macra Terror is a very interesting serial. It has a very strong script with a great story, but at the same time a notoriously bad monster, which could be a sum up of many classic Doctor Who serials. But this serial is a real treat, and perhaps ahead of its time with the ideas it's playing with. So let's get into The Macra Terror. So the serial continues almost straight after the moon base, due to a cliffhanger with a time scanner, which leads to the TARDIS landing near to a colony while a man named Medoc is trying to escape, although due to the intervention of the quartet, he is captured. So let's begin with the colony itself. We don't know much about it, but at some point in the past had been taken over and the people put into slavery, although they aren't aware due to the propaganda element at play. There are two main pieces of propaganda, these being the music, which is very upbeat and encourages people both to work and obey, while the others are the orders which are programmed into people while they sleep, something which works on Ben. Obviously there is a lot of 1984 imagery, notably the large monitor in which the leader of the colony appears on, plus the propaganda element itself, although as someone who is very unfamiliar with 1984, it means that I'm not an expert on this part of the serial. So this is where my statement about the serial perhaps being ahead of its time comes into play, in the sense that it's 1984 for kids, an idea which has become far more prominent in the television landscape in the past few decades. On the propaganda elements, I'll start with the music, because that's the more prominent of the two. It appears in two forms, either as something which is played over speakers across the colony, or as a marching band who perform and sing. The music itself is upbeat, with very on-the-nose lyrics about working for the colony. It encourages the fact that people are both happy to work and play, although the happy to work bit is far more prominent. The obvious lack of subtlety works well as the people are already under its power, so by the time the quartet arrived, the message is just being beaten into the colonists constantly. The programmed orders appears in only one scene, in which it is used on the quartet while they sleep, with the Doctor destroying the devices before he can overcome Jamie and Polly, but Ben buys into it and becomes a slave. The orders are more direct than the music, with them being spoken in a very soft way, obviously to avoid waking the subject. Now, although this only appears in one scene, the Doctor does destroy a similar device in the pilot's office. The destruction of this device is later what leads to the defection of the pilot. The people of the colony aren't the most well defined, with the pilot and Medoc being the two most well rounded. There are plenty of others, with the notable two being Ola, the leader of the guards, and Officier, who is the controller of the mining operations. Beyond that, there are plenty of other named characters, but they have very minimal roles, which I think works well to build up the scale of the colony, while not needing to be fully rounded characters. The world building is the important part of this serial, with the atmosphere of the colony being more important than the individuals. Even Ola and Officier aren't especially interesting. Ola is just the face of the guards who serves the controller, while Officier is important of the mining effort, serving as the face of that, being the one who is in charge of all mining operations, so must ensure there is a constant supply of the vital gas. Plus, technically is responsible for the safety of the miners, but that comes second to the mining of the gas. The pilot is the biggest of the brainwashed characters, being the second highest ranked person in the colony, only under the controller. The pilot is the most developed of the colonists, outside of Medoc, as he is the one who rebels against the controller after the quartet's arrival, due to a combination of effort from the Doctor and the lack of the device in his office, which as stated before the Doctor destroyed. This all led up to him taking a chance, which led to him uncovering the truth of the colony. This defection was potentially also assisted by the fact that he was a more free-thinking member of the colony, given that he was basically the second in command. He potentially would have already been more free-thinking than the others. Medoc is probably the most explored of the colonists. He is the first to break free of the brainwashing, with this occurring prior to the serial's events, although probably just before, as the situation is only just developing as the pilot is unaware of it, until he crashes into the room. This all builds up throughout the first episode, with the Doctor taking an interest in Medoc and believing him, even releasing him from the cell, which leads to their confrontation during the night. Throughout the remainder of the serial, he continues to be the outspoken voice, but he is silenced by being put in the Danger Gang, the most dangerous job within the colony, where he is to mine the gas, later being joined by Jamie and Polly. On the quartet, Polly is perhaps the least used throughout, as she assists the Doctor while trying to save Jamie during episode 4, but beyond that doesn't feel too notable. Most of her more memorable scenes are shared with others, and so she doesn't get any moments where she truly stands out by herself, although there is of course her iconic screaming, which feels like the most notable thing she does throughout. Jamie is used far more than in the moon base, with him feeling like a much more well-rounded character. He does still do a lot of things as a part of a pair, but is the one who escapes from the mines in episode 3. His most notable scene is probably after escaping from the mines and he ends up having to dance for an audience, in which he dances out the room. Ben is probably the most interesting of the quartet, or at least the companions, as he gets brainwashed, and so spends a decent chunk of time being under the power of control, with him having to turn on the rest of the quartet without even batting an eye. I've never been much of a fan of Ben. Despite having several scenes I enjoy, compared with his predecessors, he's never really clicked with me, but I think this serial really gets him on my side by making him more interesting, especially in the scenes where the control over him is being weakened, either due to something he has seen or the events which are occurring around him. Ultimately, the brainwashing breaks its hold, and so Ben is able to help the rest of the quartet quartet to save the colony. Finally, we have the Doctor, who is as great as ever. I've mostly discussed his dynamic with Medoc before, so I'll focus more on the scenes in which he just shines. The two most notable are the rough and tumble scene, in which after having his clothes cleaned up by a machine, he reverses it by using another, as he prefers the tramp look, and probably his other best scene, in which he reverse engineers the formula for the gas, which demonstrates his still immense intelligence, while allowing him to test out his opponents. He doesn't have much of a dynamic with his companions in the serial, with him often being set against someone in the colony, whether that be the pilot or Medoc. And that's it. Companions, the colony, Medoc. So the Macra Terror is a very good Macra. Despite controllers' insistence, Macra do exist and are the controllers of the colony, having taken over at some point and brainwashing all the people within it. Resembling a large crab-like creature, the Macra are a very interesting villain, being completely non-humanoid and really standing out as something you couldn't imagine being this dominating force through mental abilities. Now obviously their design is a bit naff. While interesting, the prop is basically unusable in studio, which would lead to the separation of the Doctor Who production team from Shawcraft models, but we'll talk about that more in the next one. Obviously a humanoid villain could have carried out this plot, but by making them these inhuman monsters allows them to have a really strong fear factor. The scenes of them hiding in the darkness of the surface or the mines is somewhat unnerving, even if when they're actually interacting with the actors they look completely stupid, with the most notable scene being when one has got Polly captive and Ben hits it with a stick, although the scene in which the Macra attacks the real control is pretty alright due to it being off screen. Finally, we have a big change up to the show, in the form of the updated titles. The serial introduced a new version of the iconic titles, which apart from having very different visuals, featured Troughton's face. This idea to feature a face was considered for the original version of the titles, but was considered to be too scary. A new arrangement of the theme was also meant to be used with the titles, but didn't appear until the next serial. So overall, the Macra Terror is a very good serial. Obviously not all the companions are used to their fullest, and the actual Macra prop leaves a lot to the imagination, but the plot itself is very strong, with the general feeling of the colony being unnerving, and the serial's greatest strength. But with the Macra dealt with, the TARDIS returns to Earth, landing in an airport where things are not as they seem. Next time, the Faceless Ones.